Meeting to order. To view the live stream video of this meeting, please go to the Lewis Palmer School District 38 YouTube page in the LPSD community. Ms. Wood, would you call the roll, please?
Ms. Phillips? Mr. Schwartz?
Here.
Mr. Taylor?
Here.
Ms. Upchurch?
Here.
And Mr. Clausen is absent and excused this morning.
Thank you. Dr. Summers, would you be willing to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Yes, sir. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. So our first discussion item today in this work session is will be led by Chief Financial Officer Kitty Overton, and the strategic plan team members will facilitate a discussion on efforts regarding Priority 4.
So actually, we're going to shake things up just a little bit, and I'm going to start with passing a document that is titled Priority 4 Work Session Outline. And Vicki, if you want to take that to the exec team there. So Mr. Taylor, Ms. Upchurch, Ms. Overton, and myself met last week? Goodness. Which was a planning meeting for this work session, and as we are moving through our deep dives through each of our priorities, we had actually a very robust conversation around the why, the what, and the how of Priority 4. So we're going to do things a little bit differently this month because I think the last 2, maybe even 3 months, we've spent time really presenting and sharing quite a bit of information related to Priority 3, Priority 2, and I think, goodness, all the way back to August with Priority 1. And Mr. Taylor, feel free to chime in with some of the thoughts that we discussed when we were spending time together. But what we thought would be beneficial today is to first take a deeper dive into Priority 4 by using Priority 4 as the lens by which we are looking at our other 4 priorities. And I think why that's important is that we understand there's intersectionality with all of our priorities, but in this particular priority, we're spending quite a bit of time talking about what we have established as a goal around practicing fiscal stewardship and transparency, and thinking more in terms of where we stand in relationship to a longer range financial forecast and model. The challenge for us as we process through this was we set a bar of not using numbers to have this conversation. And that's not because we know the numbers aren't important. It's because we really wanted to take a closer look at how we are engaging in a process for, again, the why around Priority 4. So I'm just going to talk through some of these bullets and give ourselves permission to question this a little bit. And then all of this is going to set the stage. We're ideally going to accomplish some work during this work session. So this is leading us toward an activity that we're going to engage with our partner pairs for each priority. So let me just kind of go through these bulleted list of items, and then we can dive right into our work. So the why of Priority 4 starts with a consideration for how we steward our resources for students, staff, families, and our community. And it's about framing our resources and our investment into our mission of every student, every day. And ideally, this improves the quality of our programs, services, and support so every student graduates as part of our mission, caring contributors to our community and being future ready. So we talked quite a bit in our planning session around the following fiscal values. And this is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but this just frames more the consideration around what is stewardship, transparency, collaboration and shared decision making, coherence, as well as the concept of opportunity cost. So just kind of think about what those different values represent as we're engaging in this work. So we know that a lot of the what of priority 4 really comes into how our resources are distributed. About 80%, as we spoke last month, revolves around employee compensation. And then there's another 20%. And again, not meant to be an exhaustive list, but what are all some of the things that we have in front of us? Everything from our academic resources to facilities, nutrition services, transportation, technology, and you can see those sub-bullets, some of the different items that live under each of those bigger or mid-sized buckets, if you will. And then when we talk about the how of priority 4, we're framing this conversation both around a day-to-day, some of our current state efforts. So when you think about our business and financial team and their essential functions, 3 of the goals that are established for our business and finance team include ensuring financials are accurate and transparent, ensuring internal and external audits function and create improvements accordingly, and also ensuring accuracy and compliance with federal, state fiscal regulations. But we also are really invested in developing more of that longer range or future and desired state. So a couple of things that fit under that heading include our Financial Advisory Committee, which is driven toward, among other things, enhancing our community's involvement and collaboration around our fiscal stewardship and transparency. And then when we think more in terms of that comprehensive longer-term forecast and financial model, there's a variety of different components that come into play, including how we account for our growth projections, demographic studies, et cetera, how we develop a sustainable and competitive compensation plan, and ultimately, how are we using all of the different variables that we know formulate how we aren't just budgeting from a year-to-year concept, but how we think about this moving further and farther into the next 5, 10, 15 plus years, if you will. So the table that you have under all of that information just shows you some of the initiatives and really the goal statement, which we did revise from our original strategic plan. And we know that this is a working document, so we're going to continue to give ourselves flexibility and permission to evaluate what we mean when we talk about not only practicing fiscal stewardship and transparency, but when you think about what ensuring effective asset management and efficient use of those resources are, we know there's several different aspects of that goal, some of which are listed out in those initiatives below. So it's possible that we can continue to refine and restate these initiatives in some different ways. So I'm going to pause there before we launch into the team activity and just make sure that I can speak to any questions, or Mr. Taylor, anything else you'd like to mention as we're about to dive into some of our work together this morning.
Well, my first comment is actually a question of clarification. So in the what of priority 4, where it talks about employee compensation being 80% and other operations 20%, that I believe is limited to the PPOR revenues, correct?
If we're looking at it from a general fund allocation, yes, that is correct.
So the MLO, the 99 MLO of $4 million a year that's split between MA and the school district, is that included in those numbers now?
In terms of that 80-20 breakdown, yes, that would be considered to be operational expenses that are
So
also.
it's the PPOR plus the
Correct.
MLO.
Correct.
Okay, so what we don't have is any debt service for capital expenditures, like the payment of bonds associated with building schools.
We did not include that particular frame as a bullet out in this breakdown, no.
But we do have to consider capacity at some point in time. I mean, we've been relatively flat on our enrollment for the last couple of years, and maybe that's always going to be the case. I don't know what our demographers are going to say, but at some point in time, we have to build into this priority 4 capacity or potential capacity and or just improvements in existing capacity. And,
Yes.
and that's not here, as I understand it.
Well, I would say it a couple different ways, and perhaps what's misleading is 80-20, Mr. Taylor, because we did lift up under facilities, program capacity, longer-term needs. So I think your point's well taken. The other component, obviously, when we talk about that longer-term forecast and financial model, we do want to make sure that we're accounting for those aspects as well, absolutely.
So the second bullet under other operations facilities includes deferred maintenance, which is, just keeping our buildings up to speed, plus program capacity or long-term needs, which would be growth. Is that right? That's the idea.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So then the 80-20 is limited to just the general fund, not capital expenditures.
Yes. So I think if we were to slice the pie differently, it's really being able to account for not only the 80-20, but also the other aspects of bond repayment, future planning around potential facility upgrading, including additional space.
Let me just ask board members, in my mind, I look at that and think there's a couple of ways we could look at this. One is we could do it from a levy perspective, right? Where we have, what is our levy? 47 point whatever.
Right now it's 41.
41 something or other. And so that levy includes debt service, right? So we could focus on the levy because we have a good history of what our levies are. That's one way. Another way would just to include employee comp, other operations, and capital, perhaps, as percentages. But somehow, I think we need to see the whole picture and stay focused on the whole picture and recognize that the 80-20 is operations, and it doesn't include capital. What are your thoughts? Do you care?
Yes, I do care. I think two things, right? What's if we back up and go and look at what's the goal of the exercise? Then my question is how relevant is understanding the delta between APEX and CAPEX?
So in terms of what we're about to dive into, I would state that as a focus on how we are within each of the priorities that we have in our strategic plan, how we are identifying what are major investments or variables under each of those priorities. So we're kind of zooming in right now through a priority 4 lens, but what we want to do is we want to account for that through each of the priorities. And then really begin to examine what the opportunity costs or what the return on that particular investment is through each of the lens of the priorities. Essentially what we're trying to do is begin to build out what this longer range forecast model can look like.
And what it takes to do it.
Correct.
Yeah, so in that regard, it probably makes some, some sense to have a crisp understanding of the comprehensive financial obligations, because it's no different than what are our limitations by statute, right? It's the rules, pardon me, it's the rules of which we've chosen to play the game, the rules that we've entered into, right, or agreed to abide by. If we have a long-term financial obligation through bonding or some other way, we just need to understand the animal so we know how we're working with it as part of what we're doing.
And I'm not sure we're in a place where we have all that ready to just pull up and work through right at the moment. So I think what we're looking to do is engage in more of the brainstorming and conceptual dialogue around those aspects of each of the priorities. So I think when we go through the exercise, which we're about to launch into, I would imagine, that will help stimulate the conversation into what are some of those key components of each of the priorities that we need to really get that crisp understanding of.
So we can do both.
Yes.
I
Other
would think
thoughts?
that both would be helpful. Because different folks are going to interpret. One set of data point is going to speak to one person, and another set of data points is going to speak different to another person. So, does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying?
I think so.
At 8:15 in the morning.
It's okay. I think getting into the activity is what's part of what is going to help us is working through this next step of the process. So, unless there's any other questions, maybe that's the best way to launch into this, and then that will lead into some more robust discussion.
What about Ms. Phillips?
I don't have anything to add. Thank you. I'm good.
Okay. Anything else before we launch into the prompt?
Let's go to work.
Okay, so here's how we're going to do this. So we've got priority 2, so that will be Ms. Upchurch, Ms. Wetstein. We've got priority 5, Ms. Phillips, Mr. Belcher. We've got kind of a shared priority 3 and priority 4 view. So we have Ms. Overton, Mr. Foster, Ms. Stieber. I think with Mr. Clausen's absence, Mr. Taylor, if you don't mind joining the priority 3 and 4 table, and then that'll leave Mr. Frampton, Mr. Schwartz with priority 1. So we've got a note catcher, which Vicki will pass out. We also have, and this will be at your tables for review, a draft of where we're currently situated with the strategic plan, including intended outcomes and action steps. This is not meant to be the focus per se of the conversation as much as it's a reference guide for you so that you can just articulate a little bit more within each of the priorities what you're seeing as those major investments. So, Mr. Taylor, I think we were planning on about 15 minutes for this deep dive. So you will complete your note catcher with your partner pair, and then we're going to share out the highlights from those conversations as we come back together. So we'll get situated and dive in. So we're gonna just stay where we're at, if that's okay, and I'm gonna hand the mic around. We are gonna go in order. So we'll have priority one team just share out their highlights from the discussion.
Good morning. We had, right out of the gate, broke the rule and went to 4 major investments within our priority. The first of which was safety and security, and we're talking about physical safety, security, primarily focusing on the safety and security staff, or those that are ongoing costs to the district, with SROs, our campus supervisors, and our security team. Our second topic was mental health. We talked about how that could be more people around more school psychologists, counselors, social workers, and the like. But we also talked about how do we move mental health into the DNA of our schools so it isn't a set aside or a standalone item, but it's something that every staff member has some training in, is comfortable with. And when I say every staff member, bus drivers, custodians, lunch staff, our teachers, of course, paraprofessionals, administrators, if they become more aware of what to look for and more comfortable around how to support kids academically and in mental health areas, that would be a success. We talked about alternative programming, both as a prevention and also as a response to students who are struggling in our schools through either expulsion or other means. We've talked about how we can support those kids who are not thriving in a more traditional school setting. And then the rule breaking number 4 is a welcoming environment. And we define that as all kids feeling welcomed as individuals and feeling accepted as who they are as an individual, and comfortable in our environment. So those are the 4. Do you want to touch base on the next piece? Actually, in the spirit of breaking the rules, we thought it might make some sense to walk through each of the 4 things under number 1 and then go right to the how and right to how where it intersects. Okay. And the other piece on the welcoming environment, it goes not purely for students but also for our staff. Okay. So on the physical safety and security piece, if you think about how do we measure quality return on that investment, we use the analogy of the TSA. The less you hear, the better you're doing. So it is really a lack of incidents. It's published and acknowledged prevention and a positive student relationship with those that are helping do that. Our first responders, the SROs, certain people in the administration that may be perceived as, for lack of a more elegant term, authoritarian. But if we can build into the DNA that this is part of the student and staff's team for success, and that's a wonderful measure of success. It clearly intersects with number 5 in communications, because we do want anybody with any nefarious thoughts to know that that does not happen here, and it will not work. On the second piece, which was mental health, how do we evaluate that, right? That's a bit subjective. And the answer is that understanding and working through mental health should be part of the DNA of the district. Happens every day in what we do, and everything we do is just a component of what we do. Rick used a wonderful analogy with technology, right? When some of us were in K through 12, technology was non-existent. And now it is part and parcel of everything we do. It's in the DNA of the educational system, and frankly, our lives, right? That intersects quite well with continuous growth of number 3. The next piece was the alternative programming. And that really was all about positive outcomes when we see something about to happen and we know where the at-risk scenarios are. and we either capture them before they happen and do something positive with them, or when they happen, we have alternatives to purely one action, which is expulsion, which sometimes puts the individuals back in an environment where more nefarious things can happen. And there's nothing positive that can come out of it. If we can create an environment where something positive can happen, then we reduce the reoccurrence. Okay? And then the last one, which was student-teacher comfort in the school community. This one was a little more challenging. And what Rick and I came up with was, the truth of the matter is, to measure return on this one, it's a subjective vibe that people feel when they're part of the school community, whether you're at a meeting off-site, or you're in the classroom, or you're walking the hallways. And what it means is it's a subjective vibe that generates joy, comfort, camaraderie, and leads to enhanced performance from the staff and the students. And that really maps well to lack of conflict and improves performance. And that would be the number. We didn't actually write down the number on that one, but that would be number 2, right? Providing a world-class education. I would argue it's also setting the pace for others to follow, which is exactly where we want to be. Anything else, Rick?
We'll go in priority order. So over here to number 2.
Okay, we weren't quite as linear as priority 1. We talked about the 3 initiatives within priority 2, which were emphasizing world-class early education, world-class secondary education, and then providing enhanced professional development opportunities for our staff. 2 focus areas within early education that we're emphasizing are the unification of support for our early childhood programming, and then supporting the literacy adoption that the board approved this past summer. So then our approach was looking at, well, how would we measure success or return on investment for each area? And we thought about looking at the results of our students who attend our preschool program as they enter our kindergarten classrooms. How are they demonstrating readiness compared to students who maybe aren't attending preschool? And we could also then say that might connect with priority 1 in how they're demonstrating social and emotional readiness for school. Feel free to jump in here at Miss Upchurch. And we talked about how some of the work we're doing to look at how we're currently servicing preschoolers at specific sites versus in their neighborhood schools, how we might look at the return on investment and using community input on that, satisfaction rates of families, and just input onto how they might want their preschool students served within our district. Then when we looked at the literacy curriculum adoption, we talked about looking at student growth in reading, as well as measuring the usage of the resources that we've invested in. We want to make sure when we've invested the amount that we have in those resources that teachers are using them, and that we're providing support with professional development, so that then connected with priority 3, as well as priority 4 with making sure we're using those resources well. You want to go back and forth? You want to talk about number 2, secondary?
So our second priority was secondary pathways and curriculum. And we looked at
when we looked at this, we looked at how would we evaluate the return on our investment, and we looked at, do we have alumni feedback, for example? And these are things I don't know the answer to, but we get asked, how do we know if we're being effective past high school, on the attrition rate in college or on career paths? We also looked at feedback of the voice from our students. And are our students invested in their education as they're going through their secondary path? Do they feel that connection? And that goes back to priority number 1 that Rick talked about. And we also talked about that goes to priority 5 and that communication piece, and making sure that our students know that they are strong stakeholders in their education and in our school district. So we looked at part of that. And then we looked at where the intersection is. It comes back to number 1. It comes back to number 5 with that communication piece, and number 3 as well. Kristen is right. Not Kristen, sorry. Amber, one of the things we talked about was this is such a big priority to tackle too. There's so many different facets, almost like a diamond. There's so many different facets to this particular priority that looking at it on how do you know if the return on investment, making sure that is, how do you measure that? And there's so many different ways to measure that. And we also talked about if it's not effective and we're looking at assessing it, then do we look at, do you throw it away or just improve? So for example, student voice, let's just take that for an example, in knowing that we've effectively reached our student voice. And if we're not, then how do we? And I went back to I thought in my mind back to the stool that when Dr. Benton was here and we talked about the 3 pillars and the platform of our students' education. So did I cover it? All right.
The final one was professional development, and we talked about the investment in our staff because while we've invested in Jenny Day's position this year as a leadership and learning coach, many of us in both student services and learning services have responsibilities for providing professional development for our staff. And so there's pieces of many of our roles that are focused on training and developing our teachers and leaders. We talked about ways that we might measure the impact of professional development. Could be satisfaction rates. What are our staff telling us after they've attended a training session? If it was impactful, if they'll use the strategies when they get back to their classrooms. We could also look at attendance rates, and then just observation as we're looking at our emphasis on PLCs. Are we seeing teachers engaging in those PLCs across the district in all of the content areas? And then finally, we talked about just the importance of the professional development happening in all of the initiative areas. So in priority 1, we're focusing on professional development for social emotional learning and safety, and some of the initiatives, secondary education and early education, making sure we're providing professional development for preschool teachers, for the literacy adoption process, for the pathways teachers at the high school, so both college prep as well as career and technical education training for teachers. And we connected that professional development initiative mostly with priority 3 because investing in our people is valuing them. Anything?
We also talked about is part of when you talk to teachers, there's a satisfaction, job satisfaction of your students learning, and the feedback of, look at the student that I taught in, I don't know, high school history, and look at them now, look at where they're doing with their life, and that there's satisfaction there of engaging with your students. And so there is part of that too, and that is why I think it's important that that's in priority 2 as well, because it also comes back to providing that world-class education to our students from the time they enter us They start their kindergarten journey to the time they leave our buildings after 12th grade.
So we had a priority 3/4 table. So I don't know who's gonna 3. Kristen?
Good morning. We took a look at priority 3 and valuing our people. One of the first things that came up again with priority 2 and priority 1 is taking a look at our people and valuing our people. And one of the first things that comes to mind is compensation. And that is truly woven in all of the priorities. I know our focus today was on priority 4, but they definitely intersect here. When we take a look at long-term planning regarding compensation, we can't just look at making increases for any one group in the immediate future, but we have to look at the long-term investment for these individuals. One of the ways in which we can look at our staff is through turnover. We've talked a little bit about natural turnover and what that might look like, but reducing turnover from what it currently is to a more normalized rate, which is typically between 10 and 15%. We talked about the intersection with priority 4, because with staff and salaries comes the financial component to that. I'm going to jump into the second one. We talked about professional development and how that also values our people, and again, that there is a cost to that, and what is the return on that investment. How that can be measured, we discussed performance and the evaluation and what that might look like for staff, and trying to make that connection, which goes back to priority 2, right? Taking a look at those professional development opportunities. And we talked a little bit about the workforce demographics, and a lot of our conversation focuses around teachers, but it's not really just teachers, right? It's those ancillary services that we provide for every student every day. So it might be transportation and getting kids safely to school, again, going back to priority 1. It could be giving them nutritional meals, which is also going to be priority 1, priority 4. So there's a lot of overlap when it comes to valuing our people. We talked a little bit about opportunities for growth and what does that look like. So whether it's professional development, whether it's something that we're offering for our educational support staff. I think sometimes we think about teachers and their professional growth, but we have a lot of staff members, such as our clerical staff, who want to grow in their positions. And if we have a clerk that wants to be a principal secretary, or we have a bus driver that wants to be a supervisor in transportation, what opportunities are we providing those employees as well? And then, again, it's going to go back to the priorities, whether it's communicating those opportunities, the financial support, the professional development. So they really all tie together. Krista, do you want to comment?
Okay, last but not least, priority 5. Oh, 4? You doing 4? Sorry. Okay, I just wasn't sure how much.
Good morning. So we had, at our table, we had to address 2 priorities, so we needed double the time that was allowed for this exercise. But I just wanted to chime in a little bit, because when we think about priority 4 and running the finance department, we do have a few major investments within that priority that could make the list. One would be banking and finance activities. Another, and I think this is probably the biggest one in my opinion, is budgeting, forecasting, and long-range planning. And in that realm, we want to make sure we're considering stakeholder input, which has been a big push for our district to engage the community in those discussions. So in terms of evaluating those types of investments, looking at developing a 5 to 10 year budget so that we incorporate the needs of the district in all the priority levels into that planning more long range. And then also perhaps taking a look at our investment strategies and making sure that we are using funds to the best of to maximize the return on the investment of the actual dollars in the finance department. So that's all I have, Chris.
Well, in communications, I like to elevate other people to be able to talk, so.
Excellent. So as we started talking, Mark very succinctly said communication department comes down to three things: people, marketing, and tools. But within those, we started having a conversation in terms of the major investments. Our conversation centered more around people and engagement. So number one, we had, and we stuck to the 1, 2, 3 initially. So deepening trust through telling our story and communication. Letting people know what the district is doing and who we are and how we're doing it. Second, the platforms for connecting with our community. And then third, engaging people and stakeholders through guaranteed communication. This idea of guaranteed communication was new to me, so I assume it might be different for some of you. It's really reaching those stakeholders that don't have direct ties to the district. How do we communicate out to them so that they're receiving everything they need and want? And so how we evaluate in terms of, Mark has a great idea to have a perception survey, an annual perception survey, so that we can see over time how people are receiving. Well, maybe you can speak to this a little more specifically.
Absolutely. Yeah, so an annual perception and awareness survey would be a tool we would engage in at the same time each year. You'd set a baseline, maybe Q1, for example, and you can design it in a couple different ways where you're asking questions around how are various groups feeling. So current students could be included or maybe not. Alumni, community members, parents with students, parents with graduated students, and you would ask them essentially, how do you feel about District 38? What are you hearing? Where are you hearing it? And you could tie in questions about how do you feel about the quality? How do you feel about the safety? How do you feel about our transparency? And ultimately what we would do is hope to, through our communication, boost those results each year. I think it would be beneficial. There's a couple of different ways you can go about it. There's the paid route, which is sometimes expensive when you're working with a vendor to accomplish this each year. You could do it more grassroots and do it through town halls and do it through votes and platforms such as online surveys. I don't know the right way to do it for us quite yet, but I think it would be a worthwhile investment.
And then in addition, as to how we evaluate, we can always evaluate trends in data analytics off the websites and other platforms and tools that Mark and his team use. I wrote down there's also a qualitative piece, and I think it ties in with what Ron and Tiffany mentioned in terms of the perception of the environment, the joy, the engagement of the community, the conversations that occur. I don't know that those are necessarily measurable, but there is a qualitative component to communication within the district, and just a thought piece for nothing else. And then let's see, do you want to cover that?
Yeah, no worries. I have poor penmanship. I am a lefty after all. So highlighting a key intersection, we may have bent the rules on this one just a little bit. We're nothing if not rule benders. We said that trust is elevated through priorities 4 and 5, and it kind of works its way out and helps build relationships through communication and allows for success in the other 3 priorities. So we're also very conceptual. We drew a megaphone where we feel 4 and 5 have trust that helps shoot out and elevate our top 3 priorities. So we had a couple ideas. Any questions for us?
Thanks for all the share outs. So I'm mindful of where we're at time-wise, but I also wonder if there's any closing thoughts. Mr. Taylor.
Thank you. So what an interesting work session. I've enjoyed this thoroughly. It's interesting that in the 5 priorities, no one touched on nutritional services, transportation, technology specifically, and or facilities, right? The capacity, the ratio of teacher to student. Those areas affect all of our priorities, but more importantly, what I appreciated the most is this concept of mental health in our DNA, because each of us, this isn't them that need it, or they, or you, it is us. And I truly think that is a gem in this conversation. The second is alternative programming. I'm aware of school districts where they actually have, they call them different things, and it doesn't really matter, but it's alternative programming for those who don't fit the traditional school. I don't know what we have or what we've done or whatever, but that's another gem. I just wanted to point those 2 things out because in my mind, boy, those are needs that we don't want to overlook. So I appreciated the conversation a lot, and there is overlap. Ultimately, as a priority 4 work session, I appreciate Kitty's focus on day-to-day, the need to support these district-wide services, and the long-range planning, and everything has a financial aspect. And I would just conclude with this thought that when we talk about trust, I agree 4 and 5 are important, but no less so than 1, 2, or 3. Because, if you look at the national narrative, 2 might be the big topic right now. So it's across the board. Trust is really built across the board, just as it takes financial resources to support the system. Those are just thoughts.
Any others? So why don't we re-situate and we can move through the rest of our agenda. I do have a follow-up question, but I'm going to allow us to get back to our original seats where we started this morning. So thank you all again for engaging in that activity. My follow-up question, and I guess this is for the whole board at this point, Mr. Taylor, is my own personal reflection is that this was a really hard exercise to do when we didn't necessarily have numbers driving some of the conversation. So I don't want that bias toward the dollars to cloud the thinking here. However, what I want to make sure that we're doing as a team is being responsive to the board's needs as well as the community's around next steps within this priority. So knowing that we do have a priority for agenda item for upcoming regular meeting, what would be most helpful in regards to some next steps in an effort to bring perhaps a little more shape or clarity to this conversation? And I guess I'll just leave it at that for the moment.
I can start. So on the first page here, we talked about stewardship, transparency, collaboration, shared decision-making. Coherence is sort of what the exercise was about today, but the other is opportunity cost. And I think that's where you were going, Dr. Summers, is, you know, you can't just have everything. So I think part of the construct that we're looking for here is, as we've talked about for a year or so, right, there's a current state, and then there's an ideal. Or what is the future state? We can call it just, what do we want it to look like? What do you want your area to look like? Because without the future state, it's hard to put numbers to it. So that's why it covers all 5 areas, right? I think our current budget is essentially as close as we have to a current state, but it's not defined as in our priority matrix. So how do you take your current budget and communicate it as a part of your priority? Because that is current state as near as I can guess. Then future state is the things we've talked about. What are our goals? What are our aspirations? What do we want our school system to look like? Well, future state, and I can just use a couple of examples. With our wage scale, right? We have a wage scale, whatever that is. What do we call it? What is it referred to in the district? Bob, what do you call that? Is it the STEP program, or what's the?
From a compensation?
Yeah, for compensation.
Steps and lanes, the
Steps
salary
and
schedule.
lanes, salary schedule. If I call it salary schedule, we're on this. Okay. So what is the current salary schedule for our school system? How does it compare with the competition, not outside of education, but the other school districts? That to me is a beginning point of where we're at, because the future state is kind of that subjective question that we want to ask our community is, where do we want our salary schedule to fit within the area, right? That's an example. Does that make sense to everyone? Because on curriculum, we could talk about, I mean, we made an investment in a reading curriculum because there was low test levels, right? Or comprehension levels, whatever it was. So we made a decision as a board, well, we can't let that happen. What do we do? And we were recommended to purchase a curriculum. Well, that's kind of like, you know, fixing the outcome. What does the curriculum really want to look like? Here's the entire curriculum. This one was published in 1953. This one was published in 1990. This one was published in 2020, or whatever. I hope I'm making my point, is what's the status of our curriculum? When did we get it? And how does it fit within the aim of what we're trying to accomplish as a school system? Again, it comes back to, well, what is that aim? And when I talk about, well, what does the salary compensation schedule look like, or what does the curriculum plan look like, those are the things I want to go to the community with and say, here's what it is, here are ideas of what it could be, what do you think? That, to me, is the next step. Now, that was just off the top of my head.
So, in follow-up to what you were saying, I think that the community and say, what do you think? I think the half step in between there is, here are our professionals in their particular departments. What is their ideal state? And I know that we won't necessarily get to the ideal right away, but I think that we did a similar process with Mr. Coates a couple years ago, where we sat down and said, tell us about security. Tell us what your ideal state for security is. And then there were more than 3 ideas, if I remember correctly. And then we had to get to the point where we said, give us top 3. And what is most important for you securing the safety of our children? And one of those was the vestibules. And then we were able to move on that. So I think having all of your admin cases really define what their ideal state is, even if the bar is really high and we won't get there in a year or 3 years or even 5 years, we want to know how it will function best and where in that functioning, what will best serve students.
Good.
That's how I would define it.
Tiffany, you're on.
So this exercise for me is a lot to take in, and it's also motivating. Does that make sense? When I look at these, I also think about defining our why in each of them, and just saying to provide a world-class education. That's a good why, but narrowing down on our why. For example, using Teresa's example with Mr. Coates. When Mr. Coates defined his top 3, he gave why those were his top 3, why they were important. So being able to focus on that, I think, is helpful as well. I had another thought, and I don't remember what it is now.
That's helpful feedback. This, I'm reminded, is an ongoing process. This is not a one and done or a November focus and then we put it back on the shelf and revisit it in 3 or 4 months. So I think one of the bigger challenges with it is how we begin to shape the costs in reference to there's only a finite amount of what we have available. So how do we make the opportunity cost more apparent as we're engaging in conversation, both within our short-term goals and issues that we're working through, as well as the longer-term future state that we're trying to work toward.
And I'd like to be able to help, as a board, to help us have the conversation in tandem so that there can ultimately be a nexus between our current state, where we're at now, and what our budget is, and where we would like to be, and what that budget would look like, and what the community is willing to support beyond that.
I would add to that I would like to see a future state that's unconstrained by resources. I would like to see what is the real aim here. What would ideal look like? And then we look at the cost, because then we have to get into the whole concept of opportunity cost. You can't have everything. But I would like to know what in each priority, what is an ideal state look like?
I like that exercise. So yes, Ms. Upchurch.
We have some resources at our fingertips too. When we did Chris, when you and I first got on this board, strategic, that comprehensive plan that was developed had some things laid out, such as facilities, and what an ideal state would look like. And it wasn't, I mean, it's older now and maybe was not complete, or maybe it was too complete, I don't know. But there is that resource to as a springboard to look at as well.
Great. Anything else as we're wrapping up this
Excellent.
super deep dive? Thank you. Appreciate all the feedback and engagement.
So the next work session discussion item is number 2, B2, budget update, with our Chief Financial Officer, Kitty Overton, and Bob Foster, supporting and talking about geothermal. Do you care which one you do first?
Yeah, I think Kitty's going to take the first few PDFs that are going to be up here, and then, yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Is this on? Okay. You have in your board packet, this is initial preliminary prediction of what the budget can look like in terms of the flexible budget changes coming based on October count. So what I did with this analysis was I took from the original adopted budget the numbers that made up general fund budget for 21-22 school year. And I've dropped in the adjusted October, that's the initial, it is not the final count, but the initial count from this October to see what impact that may have on our budget. You can see here that Monument Academy had some growth, and so the portion of the MA allocation has increased. But potentially we have 1.9 additional incoming to the general fund. Then I took my initial ending fund balance from 2021. These are unaudited numbers that you see there on the left. So originally in the budget for 21-22, the beginning fund balance was predicted to be 14.9. Actual numbers in the accounting system are coming up quite lower than that, so that impacts our budget for 21-22 as well as the change in October count. So I then took that ending fund balance projected and added the column modified budget so that you can see the new starting balance, the change in fund balance, and our new ending fund balance based on what we have budgeted to date. So when you look at the far right column where it says beginning fund balance, total program funding, then I've deducted what we have in the budget for other local revenue, other state revenue, less the Monument Academy allocation, and then our other transfers, which are already budgeted for, to come to our total revenue plus beginning fund balance. In the modified column, that comes to 59.6. And we currently have budgeted in the adopted budget 47.5 in expenditures, leaving us with that 12 million in ending fund balance. As we get to the bottom there, what this means in terms of additional funding that can be considered for additional initiatives for the flexible budget, that number comes to just a change of 623,000. So next, on the next tab of this analysis, I just want to draw your attention again to the Sr3 Preliminary Budget that we shared with you at the last board meeting. I took the same numbers, but I extrapolated them over the next 3 years, which is the amount of time we have to spend those Sr3 dollars, to try to find how much in year one, our current year 21-22, could potentially add to our general fund budget. So in other words, if we are moving some expenditures from our original adopted general fund into Sr3, what amount will that free up for other allocations? And that number in this analysis is 983,000. The final page of this analysis is simply a summary of the 623 from the first tab, meaning the additional funds available from the October 1 count, plus the potential Sr3 relief that we can consider in year one, and what would be available for supplementary budget initiatives. And then these are just items for discussion, potential uses of those funds. So the geothermal, which Bob will address here in a moment, perhaps a compensation action, and additional increases for specifically for food service and transportation compensation.
just one thing to stress in that that was just one possible scenario that we put in front of you. This is by no means anything that we are recommending as an official stance. This is just to get the wheels spinning a little bit around. Yep.
So a couple things. One, thank you. Good job. It's a lot to unpack. Secondly, this is probably the first time that I believe I've seen a very crisp delineation of what we have in our reserves or savings account, which is something in the spirit of full transparency that's very, very important to do, not just internally, but externally, and from a communication standpoint. So one of the things we talked about at the last, 2 years ago at the last election cycle was fiduciary transparency and reestablishing our credibility with the public, and this is a wonderful way to do it, amongst other things. So kudos to the team for doing that. Last question on the ESSER stuff. There's a lot of great things going on there, and thank you for diving in and making sure every penny is well used. Are there, in the spirit of that, are there any potential reoccurring costs that come out of these actions that we should be thinking about once the ESSER funds are no longer there?
Yeah, in terms of some of those line items are obviously for salaries and benefits for some critical needs that we have as a district, especially during the pandemic and the outfall of that. So there is CDE, and the source of these ESSER funds recognizes that this is a little unusual to use grant funds for positions that already exist, and they have made allowances for this, so it is perfectly within the grant requirements to fund positions. But yes, it does lead to a bigger question of what do we do when the ESSER 3 funds have been exhausted and beyond 2024.
So I wonder if maybe there's a way we can just, for lack of a more elegant term, understand the animal as we get closer, so that, to Mr. Taylor's point earlier, this long-range financial planning becomes long-range financial execution as well. Is that okay?
Absolutely. I think it's important to keep that in mind over the next 2 to 3 years as we develop the budget, to make sure that we have those positions that we intend to retain covered with the budget.
Right, and with the 800 plus positions, there's a lot of room to maneuver, obviously. But we have the uncommon benefit of time for once in this one.
Other comments?
I have a question or comment. So Dr. Summers, when you said this is just an example, so is it possible I look at the one-time compensation action, and I completely understand that ESSER 3 dollars are not a sustainable fund, so raises isn't something that would be able to be used, but is there a possibility of looking at this and saying we want to prioritize the one-time compensation action to make it more, to make that a priority? I don't know. When you opened Pandora's box to me when you said this is just one example.
Yeah, so a couple things there. One is just being mindful of we're looking at the same thing, right? The 623
Yes, sir.
after MA. So the 983, given the ESSER 3 allocation that we have also shared with you. So there's that 1.6. I do think it bears mention, and this is a good segue for Bob here in a moment to go through our geothermal challenges, because that is a project unlike any other. Bob may have other words for it. But in regards to just our intent to lean into the flexibility, so to speak, we just wanted to float a couple of thoughts around how that dollar amount might be utilized. Now, the question, I think, as it comes to how to best allocate, if we are looking at prioritizing compensation as some action, similar to what we did last year, we just decided that well, let's kind of put in front of you what we did last year and talk about it perhaps just hypothetically in that same vein, recognizing that there's mixed feelings about that one time compared to a more ongoing allocation of money. Obviously, ESSER 3 is not what, well, the 983 helps us because it gives us that cushion or that flexibility within this year's budget, but it is not something that we can leverage ongoing over time. So I think it really just boils down to, I know that's a long-winded answer to I think your question. It's just one way to look at this right now.
Okay.
And then that increase specifically to food service and transportation, we have some urgent and some real critical challenges within both of those areas. So that was part of the reason why we wanted to uplift that particular line just for some initial dialogue. Obviously, we're not making any decisions about that right now, and we hesitated to make this too formal of a recommendation. So hopefully that gives you a sense of how we're struggling with it on our end and how we want to make sure that we can be really mindful of all those components leading toward some potential action here in the next month.
Could I ask a follow-up
Of course.
question? Balance to contingency. Can you explain that again?
So when we look at where these numbers come from, the additions to what's available to allocate into general fund budgeting, if we use up these hypothetical amounts, this is what remains is 176,000. So a conservative approach on do we allocate every penny that we think we're going to have, or do we leave some aside in case the projections are not completely accurate? I would add too that there are other funds within our budget. One big component of that is the capital reserve fund that the geothermal project falls under. So as we get audited numbers, we'll know better where we end with our ending balances in those funds as well, which can contribute in some way to the general fund, right? So if we allocate less to Fund 43, that would leave more in general fund for other needs.
Makes sense.
That might be a really good segue into.
I had a
Go ahead.
question, sorry. So last year, we approved a major shortfall in food services, and as I recall, in fact, we transferred money out of our reserve account to cover that cost. And as I recall, it had something to do with the pandemic and the inability to sell anything. What's the update on that in this school year?
In the current school year, or are you thinking about where we ended up in 2021?
No, I'm talking about this budget, so this school year.
I don't have that right in front of me to really address that. If your question is what we budgeted for in 21-22 sufficient to get us through the year? Is that your?
That's not the question. The question is that we had a shortfall in the prior fiscal year. I'm going to say 300,000. I don't remember the exact number.
I think it may be closer to. I thought it was 5, but 3, 5, 8, somewhere in that.
Let's just, for discussion purposes, use $500,000.
I think it was about 5.
Okay, so
500.
for discussion, let's say it was $500,000 that we had to transfer out of our reserve account to cover because of that shortfall, because we weren't operating essentially, right? We were in a pandemic. So then the question is this: did that get budgeted into this budget the same as the prior year, or were there adjustments made based on reopening our schools? And I don't know the answer. That's the question.
There have been some operational adjustments to that and returning to a more robust feeding and food service operations. So without specifics around that, we have begun serving again and expect the revenue component to that to pick up. However, the labor shortage within the food service operation has made that very difficult to continue because we don't have the people to serve and to make the food. So we're in this conundrum of trying to find labor to cook the food.
Thank you, Bob. And I think that's what's the increase in food services. That's what that represents.
Yes,
correct?
that represents trying to address the
And I
labor shortage.
appreciate that explanation, but that's not the question still. The question is, right, is in our original budget, what did we do with that $500,000? Did we anticipate a similar shortfall, or did we anticipate something else? In this current budget that you're just doing deltas to?
Our assumption was a similar shortfall. I don't anticipate that that's going to be the same that it was this last year. So I actually think we will be coming in closer to where we've been in the past, which is a little bit more break even. So, but I think it bears a deeper dive so that we're accounting for.
And
I'm
the
happy
reason-
to take a look at
The
that,
only reason I bring up
too.
the question, and
Yeah.
I didn't expect the answer, by the way, it's something we need to look at, is when you ask for an increase in food service, then I'm just wanting to understand how that relates to the budget.
So just to be clear, that increase is representative of both and I don't want to use a dollar amount right now, but I think we're looking at increases to hourly wage for both food service and transportation to the tune of about 130. That is something that we're,
Just for resource, I
Yes.
understand.
Yep.
that.
Yep.
That still
So-
comes back to my question of, what is this budget that you're showing us deltas to reflect for food services? Because that was a big line item prior year that the board made a one-time authorization to transfer it from our reserves to cover. And I just don't know, honestly, don't know what is in this year's budget as it relates to that same
Sure.
issue.
I'm happy to do an analysis on that and present that to you.
Thank you. That's it.
okay. And now, PRHS Geothermal.
Do you have
It's
a
up there, right?
document?
Vicki, it's on there,
If you toggle over,
It's on the PowerPoint.
Okay.
there you go.
No, it's the really boring
The other
one
one.
over here. Mine didn't have pretty pictures.
You didn't have pictures in yours, Bob.
No, I know. I didn't put, I could have taken some pictures of
Okay.
drilling.
You got the information.
I thought I would keep it simple.
You're gonna have to get rid of the dialogue box and
Yeah,
your screen to show it.
I know. Okay. So, currently, we had, of course, the revenue, so to speak, of the $1.1 million in the court revenue. That came away with a redesign of the project, and this was of 8 phases, with phases 1 and 2 being the more important. Phase 1 is the drilling of the geothermal, and phase 2 is running the geothermal into the building. Those two combined, but mechanically, and that they were separate. The relocation of the geothermal field, where we are right now, to simplify this for you. Trying. Come on. Is the existing loop fields currently, as of today, are at about 25% of capacity. That means that were this warm weather, the building would have lost or is about to lose cooling capacity with the existing loop fields. The cost to replace the fields came in at approximately $2 million. We saw a very rampant increase in materials and labor. As you can imagine, the only bid to fix the field came in considerably above $300,000 to $400,000 above our original estimates of what it would cost. The drillers basically said that's what it's going to cost to do it. We cut the boreholes down to 80 boreholes to a depth of 600 feet. Drilling and installation is to be completed by February. I put February as a good time frame for that. Right now they're telling me January, but they didn't anticipate any snow. I'm anticipating snow. The horizontal drilling operations into the building and the ductile pipe working into the building, the new 8-inch lines running in there are done. and they are running that in as we speak. So that is becoming in there. Continuing to be done and needing to be done would be the replacement in future years of the PVC and with ductile piping inside of the building. So that would be an addition. However, that is not at an immediate point of failure. It does present some problems over the few years in that, but it is not an immediate failure. With the existing loop field failing, as we actually just lost the last header pairs last week before last, we lost another series of header pairs. The cooling capacity and the heating capacity are coming down. However, by February, that should be rectified. And the 80 boreholes will be able to run not only Palmer Ridge in its current configuration, but should also be able to handle a 30,000 square foot addition if it's ever added, and that back part of the land. That's where we stand as of today. We're at about 25 holes drilled.
So is the high school being heated
Yes.
adequately between now and February?
Yeah. Yep. We are running, right now, the heating off of the existing loop field is enough with the support of the current boiler system. We're just running that boiler a whole lot more, so energy costs in that building are going to be higher until the loop fields come back online.
So there's a trade-off payback there, right?
There is a trade-off payback. The interior boiler currently is supplementing the field to a much higher degree than it was ever envisioned to support.
So on a 1 to 10 scale, how healthy is that boiler?
About a 9.
Okay.
It's a newer boiler. It's about 5 years old. 6
That's
years old.
important.
Yeah.
Because that's a single point of failure, yeah?
It is a single point of failure.
Yeah. Okay. It's a lot of space heaters otherwise, right?
I don't like to think in that term, no.
Gloves, hats, other things.
Yeah.
The good news is, Bob, would you say the operational ability of the building to stay warm is not as big of the issue right now as
Correct.
as the
The longer term, yeah, it's going to stay warm for now.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I'm just not remembering all the other presentations prior to this, but I see 1.1 million in court settlement, and then I see 2 million.
We had originally laid it on at about 1.6 million. It's going to be closer to 2 million with some contingency built into there.
So the difference is coming from?
Materials and labor and drilling.
No, but I mean,
Yeah.
Source of
how are we?
The source of funds is going to be the general fund. That was where Kitty had increased that.
we did.
Could I build on her question?
Yeah, go for it.
Sure.
I want to talk about the cap reserve.
Yeah,
But-
because 1.1 from a court settlement, 2 million it says for phase one. Now I see there's 8 phases. So phase one is way over our.
Phase one is way over. We haven't gotten estimates yet for phase one, phase two. Those two are sort of a combined phase of running the piping.
Say
in.
so here because that's
Yeah.
scaring the heck out of me.
That-
This looks like bad news on steroids. It's not. You're just the messenger. I'm not.
Oh, no.
You know,
It's
the point is you've said there's 8 phases. Most important is phase 1 and 2. Phase 1 then is 2 million, and I've got 7 more phases. And how much are we?
those 7 more phases. I haven't gotten an estimate, a hard estimate on that, but they are by far. They can be split up and doled out in smaller doses. It's mostly piping and heat pumps within the building and heat pump size, so they can reduce the heat pump size. Some of that calls for a reduction in heat pump size. The piping, we can run ductile piping in segments rather than doing it all at once. So there are some ways to schedule around that in the future that would be and make that much more bite-sized.
In the interest of transparency, I would like to see an estimate.
Okay.
What these phases are going to cost.
The-
I mean, the 2 million was originally estimated. I think you just said at 1.6. 1.6. Sorry.
1.61.
So we knew it was going over budget by $500,000. We knew that, but it's actually by more.
Right.
And that's not the issue. The issue in transparency is what is this a $5 million problem?
The
I mean,
the
you see
original,
where I'm going?
No, I understand. The original Tolan estimate from the lawsuit was $4.4 million, but that was 5 years ago.
So we can update that, hopefully.
We could, and I can ask Tolan, who is performing the work right now. I can talk with them about giving us some ballpark figures. Not a whole lot of them are willing to commit to hard numbers with the way materials and labor are going.
Well,
They'll give us some ballparks.
but in the
Yep.
spirit of transparency,
Certainly.
I would even stick with the 4.4 because that's a number you have.
Yep.
And then discount it to the fact that it's not current numbers.
Right.
But it gives us a magnitude that right now in this presentation, and frankly in the last presentation, we haven't seen.
We can update that. And then, Kitty, can you talk about the cap reserve?
Yes, so I hesitate to overcommit what's in cap reserve because we don't have audited numbers yet. But I believe that there's going to be a fairly healthy beginning fund balance coming through Fund 43, which would mean the funds are already in Fund 43 without the additional allocation from general fund. So last year, there was an allocation made in the 2021 budget of approximately $800,000 from general fund to cap reserve, and I don't believe we touched very much of that allocation in terms of expenditures last year.
Among other projects, but Palmer Ridge was one of the projects that we were anticipating.
I'm also anticipating perhaps not a full cost to us for the Prairie Winds project, as I'm seeking damages in an insurance settlement because of the freezing. So we may get part of that back.
And then along with that, and we did not, just in the spirit of time and not going into every detail this morning, have a deferred maintenance scope and different projects that we're identifying across the board there that we can zoom into more as well.
Did we put into the cap reserve the amount of our contribution to the Schneider project?
In the budget for 21-22, is that?
Well, I guess. I asked specifically, is that as a part of your capital reserve?
Yes, in the capital reserve budget for 21-22, there is a component that is our cost for the
For
Schneider.
the Schneider
Yes.
project.
I have, the Schneider Electric contract was $9.1 million. The district's portion, I believe, is 1.7, and that came from general fund. It's part of that 3.4 use of fund balance for the 21-22 school year.
Did we not move that from reserves?
It was reserve.
Okay. We need to lock these numbers down and
Okay.
really do need to see transparency on this project. If it's over 5 million, whatever the number is, that's not the point. The point is we need to be visible there.
Just the 8 phases.
You're right.
May I plant a seed on this one? Sure. This seems to have a life of its own, right? Independent of how it phases through. And given that it's a green initiative, have we entertained the quantity of grants that are available for green initiatives?
Right now, we're in a fact where it's not truly an initiative on itself, it's remediation on something that was, I believe that probably would have been more effective on the front end rather than remediating construction defects was the original lawsuit.
But ultimately, we're implementing something that takes us off traditional
Right.
Sources of heating and cooling, which is a green initiative.
We can certainly look into see if we can
Just
find
wondering,
any
there's
others.
so much out there right now.
Right.
That's a good point.
Thank you.
It's a really good point.
I appreciate that, Chris. And I appreciate the work that you're putting into this too, because this is something that happened a long time ago. And as we work through it and we look at these different phases coming into this, that transparency of what we're looking at, because, and I think the reason that's important is so that we know when we're talking about, when we just did this, our exercise with our 5 rocks, this does obviously cut into that as well and needs to be fixed. Thanks.
Policy update?
I think we're ready.
Let's move to the agenda item B3, which is a continued discussion on the policies that we had a first reading for on the October 18th, 2021 regular meeting. Have there been any changes to these proposals since October 18th?
No changes to mention.
Any comments or questions by the board?
These are all statutory changes, except for the the written comments to the board.
Correct. BEDH-E was based on our other conversation
Right.
around
Yeah, remember that.
that component.
And I've had no feedback. Have any of you had feedback on those suggested changes? So I think we're ready to move on unless you had something you wanted to highlight.
Nope, we are ready.
Let's go to the next. Would you guys like a 5-minute break?
Use the restroom.
Pardon me?
Just use the restroom. Yes, please.
Second.
Let's do a 5-minute break.
5 minutes.
I mean, I was gonna hold on.
We're almost there.
You said that, yes.
I had no idea what I should say. I think she saw it on my face too. So she just.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and get the COVID thing done. Yep. That's what I'm hustling for.
Okay. Where are we? I didn't see, yeah. I know we're working on I don't know what we're waiting on. All right. Okay.
Where did it go?
No.
right, don't forget to sign those. You will forget? Oh, silly guy.
Well, the other thing to talk a little about would be a nice little, quick little pregame.
Yeah. Testing. Testing.
I'll find out and let you know, Teresa. Yep. I think it's, yeah, it's somewhere, but I don't know about the top of my head.
This one. I can hear it quite loud. I don't want to speak now.
Mr. Taylor, whenever you're ready, sir.
Welcome back. Thank you. The next item is an update on the, sorry, it wasn't regional, was it?
No, it's state.
Fall CASB conference update.
Yep.
Subchurch?
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. So yes, this was the statewide Colorado Association of School Boards Fall Conference and their delegate assembly. The delegate assembly is where basically the platform for legislative session, what CASB, what they use for their position on their platform. And it kicked off Friday with the fall assembly, the fall conference. And there were some really good breakout points, and I just want to point out one that I attended, and I thought it was pretty impactful because it specifically addressed something that a lot of the school board directors that were there have been facing. And we talked a lot about how school boards across the nation are in the direct crosshairs of a lot of discord and confusion and throughout the nation. So one of the breakout sessions that was particularly impactful to me was Bill De La Cruz led it, and it was called Division, Discords, and Decision Making in the Board's Role in Adaptive Times. And it was really good. Actually, Mr. Cruz gave me his book. He's local, and so it was just a very impactful breakout session. But there's also some that I'm hoping that they will provide during the winter session because it's helpful for all of us. There was strategic planning and effective agendas was presented by some members of the District 20 School Board. And that was also really important. I think you guys could resonate that failure to plan is planning to fail. So it was really good. So moving on though, so we're gonna go to slide 2. Let me do that real quick. So I wanted to give a brief rundown of what the purpose of the assembly is for. So each summer, CASB issues a call for resolutions, and we don't always, can I just take this off? Hello, I got this one. Okay, so each summer CASB issues us and all the school districts across the state a call for resolutions. And school boards, that's where we have an opportunity to provide input on public education issues for this legislative session that will start up in January. And then they compile those resolutions and prepare data. They recommend them. It comes from LRC, which stands for the Legislative Resolutions Committee, and I have requested to be on that state committee through CASB. And then the members of the committee review, they submit the resolutions, they develop it into this booklet called the 81st Delegate Assembly booklet.
And at that delegate assembly is where we as delegates adopt those resolutions, and we use It's funny that we have a Robert's Rules of Order here. I don't know who gave this to us today, but it's pretty cool because that's what we use as RRO, is as our guidepost when and it's just like any delegate assembly, but it's where it provides a foundation of CASB's governance structure. It provides them with direction when they present to members of legislation the interests, and they speak on behalf of what us delegates have voted on. I can do that. There we go. So this year, there's 3 primary avenues that CASB looks at when they look at, and they can usually fit almost all the resolutions that are presented into 3 categories: local governance, finance, and student achievement and growth. There are 12 standing resolutions that sustain every year. There was one small amendment, and it was a simple amendment from shall to may. Then they did something different this year. They often, when they present resolutions, these resolutions come through, and the LRC, which is again the Legislative and Resolutions Committee, they will usually make recommendations that they all voted on and agreed on. And this year they presented it differently as a consent agenda. But each of those resolutions was still presented by the school district that proposed the resolution to explain. It still had to have a second, and then those 12, some amendments, things like that. And so those were passed. And then there was 8 additional resolutions that were introduced, and I can go through them, and I'm about to show you where there's a link. I hope you guys went through it. But of the 8 that were introduced, 2 were struck down. One was on marijuana, and one was really confusing language. So those 2 school districts rescinded their proposals. 3 failed and 3 passed with some amendments. And there was one additional resolution that passed from the floor, and it rarely does pass through the floor, but I am excited to see this one come through because they use data. There's some national data that's been presented. And at the next, I will share that with you guys as it comes out. That's still in development. But when you look at the proposed resolutions, that's what this book was. And then if you click on that link, you can see what the final resolutions that came through that were passed. So of those ones that were passed, only 3 additional passed, and it was mostly around, the big topic was financing, school finance. The school finance formula, funding for educators, funding for schools, rural funding, and teacher compensation. So that was a pretty strong theme. What I thought was interesting is that of all of them, 5 resolutions were on local governance, 10 resolutions were on finance, and 1 resolution was on student achievement and growth. So you can see that that was the trend. The next steps, and I have this slide here because I want to show you, if you look on those links up there, reason that those are important I think to us is that first one. If you go to CASB's website, there's some good tools through CASB, and that's called it's called the bill graphic. And that gives you a good idea of how many bills were introduced, how many passed, and how many were that CASB lobbied based on the resolutions. And the reason I think it's important that we are looking at these is, of all of our resolutions that we passed, 7 of them were presented by Poudre Valley School District. And then the next one, 3 of them were presented by St. Vrain, 2 by Adams, and by D11. So it's important that we continue to be engaged and a part of this conversation, because what this shows is, of the resolutions we looked at, there were 3 main school districts in the entire state of Colorado out of 178 school districts that presented resolutions. So we need to be a part of that conversation. So, and I wanted to share this with you guys because I think it's important that we continue to make sure that we have a strong voice on behalf of our Tri Lakes community and D38. And so I think it's the being a part of the delegate assembly is essential to have our voice heard. we have an opportunity. School districts will usually, when the call for resolutions goes up, usually in April or May, school districts will deliberate on it in June, vote on it in July, and pass it on to CASB for consideration on in August or September before the deadline. But when the bill tracker, there was 100 and, thank you. So if you look at the bill tracker, because I couldn't pull it up, thank you, Mr. Schwartz, 106 bills of the total of the there's 678 bills that were introduced last year. 106 of those were education related specifically. And you can look at that bill tracker tool and you can scroll down and see exactly where each bill focuses in on. You can see which ones passed and were signed by the governor. And there's a spot that shows where CASB stood on that bill tracker based on the delegate assembly. So that's what that first link is. The second link is there's the 9 steps on how we as school board directors advocate for our schools. We're expected to have relationships with our lawmakers and having those active conversations and advocating for our students and our school district. The third one, that one explains to you who are the leaders in education in Colorado, from our State Board of Education to our legislators on the Joint Budget Committee and on the Education Committee. That last one is an interesting one, and that is called, if you look at it, it's called a balancing act. And if anybody ever wants to know how is funding calculated in Colorado, where does it come from, you only have so much money in the pie. So what this interactive tool does is it shows what your state budget is, and then you get to decide what are your priorities. Okay, I want to prioritize education. Well, then what's going to be cut? I want to prioritize roads. Okay, what's going to be cut? So it gives you a good interactive tool, and I would encourage anybody to go on that website and just play around with it. And if you had the power, what would you change, and what would you advocate for, and what would you fund? So, any questions? Oh, also, to save the date, so our legislative session starts up January 12th, and the Colorado Association of School Boards Winter Legislative Conference, which is where we get to speak with our legislators, is February 24th and 25th. It's not just for delegates. Any of us can go.
I have a couple questions or comments. First is these standing resolutions, they're essentially just resolutions that over time CASB always advocates for with the legislature?
Yes. So our standing resolutions are, so to give you an example of one of them on local control. Essential functions of the local Board of Education's constitutional authority include establishing the course of curriculum and instruction, the process for determining the terms and conditions of employment for school district employees, and the budget to be used to implement the local community's priorities. So that's an example. That standing resolution, yes, it stands the test of time. It is these standing resolutions regardless of what the school districts say this is what's important to us today. These are always important based on Colorado Constitution, based on governance policies, so they use these as their guidepost as well.
I think it also speaks to the fact that a lot of legislation, as it occurs in many realms, but especially in education, is not just a one-year process, it's a multi-year process. So when I've been up there before, CASB puts forward these resolutions in the hopes that, you know, we can build on them as the years go on.
Is it possible for us to get the code to the co.abalancingAct.com? Because what a great tool for our local community and our long-range strategic plan. We just spent a lot of time talking about what's the ideal. We can talk about what those costs are, but a tool like this where a person could log in and say, well, I want 3 new school buildings, or I
Another
want
bus.
whatever. The balancing act would be awesome. If it's possible, we could access it or get a copy of it for our local school district.
We're investigating that. There would be a cost, of course, but I think it's something that we would like to certainly envision as well.
I think that's a fantastic idea. It was actually eye-opening for me. And then I also want to touch on one more thing. I know several of us will be at the winter retreat that's coming up. One of the keynote speakers will be speaking, actually I already have his book, Reaching Your Next Summit, and I think that will be pretty impactful for us to attend as well. But it talks about, he will talk about what are we doing to ensure that we are reaching our summit for our kids in our community. And that is a really good question. I think that would be a great way for our community to see, okay, balance our budget for us then.
Yeah, so the model would have to be built as a what-if model, obviously. 'Cause what if I do this, and this is what it looks like? But essentially, that's what we've been leaning into for time here. But to be able to make that a tool available to the public could create a great communication venue for us.
Indeed.
Anything else?
That's all I had. Did anybody else have any other questions?
Quick question. Is there any feel for the success rate of the resolutions to becoming actual law?
I don't know the answer to the success rate. It'd be something you could look at on that bill tracker and see, compare it to resolutions of the past. Sometimes they have become law, and sometimes it's advocacy. It kind of depends, I think, on, Matt Cook, for example, is one of CASB's, I can't remember Matt's exact title, but he's very active in legislation and has a good relationship and rapport with the lawmakers in Denver, and he uses these resolutions as his guideposts. So, local control, for example, when you see bills come down the line that are directing school districts to do X, Y, or Z. That local control piece is what he uses to remember, and that's based on the Colorado Constitution, that school districts, I'm skipping, but one of the things we see a lot of that we see at CASB advocate on behalf of school districts, and we as school board directors have a responsibility to advocate on behalf of our school districts. Unfunded mandates. That's a big one that we talk about a lot, is the mandates that get passed down that are unfunded. And especially when we're already trying to balance our own budgets and we get thrown with another mandate that, I don't know, for an example, we're talking about geothermal today. Let's say a bill gets passed and we didn't advocate against it, and now we have to spend that money on some unfunded mandate. I mean, that's an extreme example, but you get the picture, I think.
Thank you.
Anything else? Is the next section, we're talking about some dates on our meetings. Are we going to put that on the overhead, or do we just need to open it up and discuss it?
Actually have a hard copy that Vicky printed out, so we can perhaps.
It's the same as what we have,
It's
though.
the same on the, yep, it's in
Does
exact
anybody want
content as
a
well.
hard copy?
Either way. So just a couple of mentions here and decisions around upcoming meeting dates. So we had originally placed a hold on our December work session for either November 30th or December 7th. Since we have a regular meeting on November 15th and the December regular meeting is December 13th, we are, assuming this works for everybody, recommending that we hold it's called a December work session, but it would be November 30th, so last day of November.
So every 2 weeks, between now and December 13th.
Correct. So I just wanted to make sure that that was called out and see if that worked for everybody.
Any concerns for your individual calendars? And so what I'm hearing is we'll do November 30th for the December work meeting.
Yes. Okay, so we can change that one. And then we wanted to talk through January and February regular meeting dates. So the reason we do not have currently a meeting scheduled for the third Monday on January or February is due to holiday conflicts. So currently we have Monday's regular meeting scheduled for January 24th. And maybe we'll just talk about that one first. There's the thought that maybe moving that to January 13th, or excuse me, January 18th, the third Tuesday. We don't necessarily have a preference on that, but the pivot that could not follow suit is the February one, so I did not know ahead of time that I was going to be out of town on the week of February 14th. So that February 14th meeting will not work well for me, but we don't have it on the 21st because that's President's Day. So I guess we could potentially have it the 22nd if that works in February. And how do you guys want to approach January and February?
Well, what's your suggestion for January 1st?
I think we're good with either January 24th or if there's desire to have it on January 18th, we could certainly do it the following day.
There's no conflict on the 24th?
There is no conflict for me on the 24th.
Why don't we just keep it then?
Yeah, let's stay
Be
there.
undisruptive.
That sounds great. So we can maintain the 24th, but we do have to maneuver around the 14th.
So the 14th, I mean, that's a Monday, correct? And
Yes.
the following Monday, you're out of town.
No, that I am out of town the 14th,
The 14th.
but I will be back as of the following week.
So the 21st, though, is a holiday.
Correct.
So we need to go to a Tuesday?
If we go to the 22nd, that would work, if that works for the team.
Or the 15th? Is that, no, you're still
Are you
not,
out of
probably.
town on
We'll
the
still be out.
Okay. So it sounds like for February the 22nd is the suggestion.
Yes, that is our official suggestion.
I very much support that. Instead of the 14th. I would appreciate the 14th to be able to spend time with on that holiday. Because that's Valentine's Day, obviously. President's Day is the 21st.
Is that a school holiday?
It is. We do not have school on the 21st either.
So the 22nd, what do y'all think? I'm okay with it.
The 22nd works for me.
Works for me.
Ron, you good? 22nd?
Yeah, I may have to come in remote, but yes.
Okay, let's.
So
aim for
we're
the
dialed in for
22nd.
November 30th work session, February 22nd regular meeting, and I think those are the
Two
changes or edits.
What's that date for the work session?
November 30th.
Okay.
Okay, that was it for that topic.
Great. The next discussion item is the superintendent's update. Let's see, who would do that? Just kidding.
Two things. The first is our updated COVID numbers that you can see built into the agenda. And unless there's any questions, I'm just going to let the numbers do the talking, so to speak.
Are there associated absences with the COVID positive cases? I know last year there were quarantines and as associated with a single case. Or isolations, but we're not keeping those numbers.
We have not included numbers of quarantines. I can tell you that there are specific situations depending on the level of risk and the potential exposure and the collaboration with the health department on when those quarantines may occur, but we have not been keeping
Tracking per
track
se.
per se.
And my question, I guess I'm thinking about, like, in the case of Palmer Ridge, how many students or contact days were affected by that outbreak? Or do we not know?
Well, I guess you could use a formula that states that 10 days from initial symptom onset, given the number of cases that we're looking at, you could do the math on that. It's not always 10, it's 10 calendar days, so it depends on when that falls in terms of how many school days are missed.
Right.
That would be, I mean, we could certainly track that. That's a little bit of a lift, to be honest, if we were to track the number of days missed, because there's a student component to that, there's also a staff component to that. So.
And I'm just trying to, I'm not trying to put you on the spot. I'm just trying to connect dots to the previous conversation where there's a funding line about making up for lost student time, but does that relate more to the time when the district was fully online as
Yes.
opposed to now?
Yes.
Okay.
So that funding conversation I would separate out from where we're at least in terms of the impact to, yes, there's an impact obviously to kids not being in school when they are isolating,
Sure.
as well as staff that may have to isolate pending that positive case.
And then I guess point two is overall and I know we don't have any like quantitative feedback, but in terms of kiddos missing school, well, let me put it, are they doing okay academically? If, you know, for those who have been out 10, 12, 14 days being sick or quarantined, how are we as a school district serving them?
So, really good question in terms of what that means for each individual student. There's obviously components to how we're working with them to make sure that they are staying up to speed. At a high school level, that definitely involves both support from teachers, counselors, other resources as needed. Typically, what we use as a good rule of thumb is that for every day that a student is out, they have a couple of days to make up work that they may have missed. So we're not penalizing kids academically for missing. We're adjusting and trying to keep the, you know, obviously we're not doing synchronous learning in the same way that we did last year, but I think, you know, case by case, situation dependent, we're definitely working with our students around those issues. But it would obviously have a conversation around every individual kid and where they're at to be able to answer that question as to what kind of impact have they experienced. It's not always typically 10 full days that they're out. Usually, I'll give you an example of like a kid maybe testing positive on a Wednesday and still being in school perhaps as of a Thursday, Friday, or excuse me, if they've tested and we found out 2 days later, you're gonna have a week that they're probably missing. Does that make sense? As opposed to like 10 full school days. So it really is case by case dependent as to when that start and when that end date are. Yes.
Do we have any data on how this compares to other parts of the state or the country?
There's a lot of data in regards to county data, state data. In terms of school district view, we've not necessarily analyzed it down to that level. We've seen, and we're right in the middle of another uptick right now at the county level. So we've seen a couple of those upticks over the course of the first semester. I think generally speaking, and we talked about this even last year, what the county may be going through, we typically see a correlation to that county surge. Now, what's interesting is while there is that uptick, and I'm not going to minimize any of our numbers, it may not be quite as drastic currently as it has been in other surges that we've experienced. So a lot of different ways that you can unpack that.
I want to build on what Ron just said. There is the El Paso County Health.org/COVID-19 data dashboard, which I can't open inside this building for some reason. But when I do open it at home, I'm able to see all the outbreaks at all the schools, at whatever level, the number of cases, etc. Can I confirm that Palmer Ridge was our last outbreak reported?
We've had 3, yes. We've had 2 in the elementary level, 1 in the high school level. Palmer Ridge was our last.
And that was like September 30th, as I recall. According to the
roughly,
dashboard.
roughly, yep.
But the dashboard itself is really good because it's got like 14 different pages of different analytics. It breaks it down by zip code. It breaks it down, the outbreaks by who reported it. So it's not just school districts, it's all outbreaks. And then it shows there's you can actually adjust the time frame. So a lot of the data will be from the beginning of the pandemic, March of 2020 till now. But you can squeeze that down to August, like the beginning of the school year, and just see the trends more recently. Anyway, I find it very informative.
There's also the COVID-19 Children and Youth Data Brief. I believe it's published each Wednesday, and pretty consistently. Oh, they're doing every 2 weeks now? Okay, every other Wednesday then? Give or take. It's quite helpful to see what the effects and what they're tracking with regard to children especially.
And that's on the same site.
It is.
Yep. So that's a good site. But it's not, I don't think it's just El Paso County, but I guess that's where my interest lies mostly. So your question about comparing it statewide or national, I don't know. We don't track that, I guess, huh? Too much?
It's a lot.
Yeah. But the El Paso County I think it's really helpful information. For some reason, I can't open it in here, though.
We may have a filter that, for whatever reason, doesn't like that.
COVID is probably the COVID filter.
Maybe. There's only one other thing, unless there's anything else related to COVID, that I just wanted to share with you all. We did not loop it into the agenda, but I can pass this down the row. As part of our continued engagement with our staff around particularly our priority 3 work and efforts and compensation conversations, we will be at the following sites at the following days and times. And so if your schedule permits and you'd like to jump in, we've got about a 30-minute window which with each of our school staffs that you can see there. So if you do have the ability to make any of these, we wanted to invite you. And if so, if you can just give Vicki a quick response and just let her know if you can make it, we'd welcome your presence at those conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ron, do you have any comments, board member comments?
Yes. To my teammates, colleagues, and constituents, please exercise your privilege to vote. That's all.
Tiffany?
I don't think this is, oh, there, I can do this. No, I think I covered mine during our CASB, the CASB discussion. Casey, I did have a question. I couldn't get this to click. There was I can't find it right now, the dashboard from where we were on our numbers, on our COVID numbers last year as compared to this year. When we used to have our dashboard. So it was interesting. I can't find it right now, but it was interesting to see where we are comparatively, say Bear Creek, from this dashboard that you just posted to shared with us versus last year. I don't know where it's at. I can't remember, Mark. I
I'm not
thought-
sure that we're keeping last year's dashboard.
Might have a screenshot. I
Okay.
saw it at our last school board meeting, and I meant to. It was good comparative information to look at that moment. Our 2 high schools were higher, but our elementary schools this year were lower. From this time this year versus last year.
Okay.
Not quarantines, just cases.
Uh-huh.
But it was good information to just be able to have that comparative data. It was good. That's all I was trying to share, but I couldn't find it, so
Okay.
I was asking if we knew where it was.
We can talk about that.
Okay. That's all I had. And also, yes, it is voter day, so vote.
Teresa?
I don't have any comments, thank you.
Well, in the spirit of Thanksgiving, I just want to thank everyone for their mental exercise today with us all, because I thought that was one of the better work sessions that I've experienced in 4 years. And I'm excited to work with each of you and the work that you're doing, because, you know, this a balancing act, I'm going to use that now that we found that term. It is a balancing act. And I look forward to being able to actually have a tool, right, that we can then do some what ifs and see what it means. And it really, really is exciting to me. I've never been more excited to be a member of the board than I am presently, and to work with you all. So I want to just formally say thank you to all of you for the work you do. And I hope this extends then to the principals and their administrative staff and to the teachers. A big thank you for everything they do to make it important that every child every day is being attended to properly. So thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, we'll adjourn until November 15th.
Awesome.